before I start this, I have to tell you, I've only given this lecture 3 or 4 times, and I think the last time was at least a year ago. It may have been 2 years ago. So I've been doing a lot of refresher on this because there are not a lot of books that are written about Admiral Thomas Hart. There's one that was put out by the Naval Institute Press a few years ago, but then digging around, I found some doctoral dissertations that were written on. So I've been able to glean a little bit more information from this. So, and I'm always changing my lectures around anyway. Even if I've given them 100 times, I always find some fault with them. Or my biggest fault is that they're too long, so I have to go in there and cut stuff out. And I go, oh. But anyway. So feel free to critique this. If there's something I say in here that doesn't seem to quite clear, or maybe you know something I don't know, feel free to come let me know. But now I'm going to start off by asking you a couple of questions. Number one, how many people have ever heard of Admiral Thomas Hart? Okay, how many of you have ever heard of General Douglas MacArthur? Ha-ha! Okay, so hopefully by the time this lecture is over, you're going to understand a little bit why you know more about Douglas MacArthur than you do about Tommy Hart. So, but to start off here, Thomas Hart was only one of 4 4-star admirals just prior to Pearl Harbor. Okay, at this time, General MacArthur, who had already retired from the Army in 1935, but then called back to active duty while he was in the Philippines, he was only a 3-star general at this time. And he didn't like that. So, but he had a stellar career. He entered the U.S. Naval Academy at the age of 16. He was still a teenager when he graduated, or just out of, if you can call 20, I don't know if 20 is still a teenager. But by the time he got out, though, he was a young naval officer during the Spanish-American War. I think he was recognized early on as being very intelligent, very hardworking, very ambitious, and he went right up through the ranks. And if you attended my lecture on submarine warfare in the Pacific, you'll know that early on our torpedoes that we used on our ships, and this is before we even started using submarines, they were the torpedoes are built by the Whitehead Company. It's a British torpedo. But in 1914, the United States Navy opened up their own torpedo factory in Rhode Island, and young Thomas Hart, I think he might have been a lieutenant commander or a commander by then, he was put in charge of the torpedo factory we had in Rhode Island. And what they did is they purchased these Whitehead torpedoes and then modified them for use on U.S. Navy ships and then eventually U.S. Submarines, and also found ways to improve on them. He had some success, but there were still a lot of bugs in some of the torpedoes even after he left. But he came back again after, I think it was right after World War I, and sent back there to work out some of the bugs that they were having in the torpedoes. He got himself in a little bit of a political trouble at this time because the future president of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, was Undersecretary of the Navy under Josephus Daniels. This is during Woodrow Wilson's administration. And I guess he made some complaint either to Josephus Daniels or FDR about the problems he was having with the Machinists Union. And Roosevelt didn't like that because he wasn't even president. He wasn't going to be president until 1933. But he thought in terms of domestic politics, and of course when he got into office during the Great Depression, he introduced the New Deal, and he was very pro-union. So even back then, FDR just made a mental note about this guy Thomas Hart. He might be a hard-working, intelligent, and a guy who's going up through the ranks, but he made a mental note about he didn't like this guy because he thought he was anti-union, even though he got along with the rank and file within the union because they worked together very closely in manufacturing and try to improve on these torpedoes. So later in the career, after he'd had about 40 years in the service, he's getting towards the end of his career around 1938, 1939. And usually for somebody who could actually reach the star of the rank of a 4-star admiral, his last duty assignment might be the Atlantic Fleet. That was sort of the icing on the cake for his career. And then after so many years then he would quietly retire. But Roosevelt was president by then, and he turned down Admiral Stark's request to put him in ahead of the Atlantic Fleet. Admiral Stark at the time was the chief of naval operations. But sort of a second prize, they sent him out to the Philippines and China to take command of the Asiatic Fleet. Now, Asiatic Fleet, that's where you sort of send the guys you want to get rid of, the alcoholics and the ne'er-do-wells and stuff like that as far as officers. But he took his job quite seriously. So even from the get-go, he was aware of the conflicts and the going on between Japan and the United States, and he's aware of War Plan Orange, which was supposed to prepare us for any possible conflict with Japan. And of course, this is Douglas MacArthur. He only had 3 stars at the time, and he had known of Thomas Hart for a long time, almost as long as they'd both been in the military, and they got along quite well. And Thomas Hart was also a very good friend of Douglas MacArthur's older brother, Arthur MacArthur III, who graduated from the Naval Academy. And he was a bright up-and-comer, too. It's quite possible that if Arthur MacArthur had not died, I think it was appendicitis or something like that, in the early 20s, there could have been 2 MacArthurs fighting World War II. That would have been interesting. But they got along. But when Thomas Hart was sent out to Asia, and what they did is, during the summer months, most of the Asiatic fleet was up in Chinese waters, and their gunboats were going up and down the Yangtze River, protecting American interests. And other colonial powers, the British and the French and Germans, they also had their Asiatic fleets and their Yangtze patrol vessels protecting supposedly their assets out there. But during the cold winter months, when it was cold up in China, they would bring most of the fleet down to the Philippines. Okay, and they could take their families over. The officers took their families with them, and they would live ashore when they were in China, and then when they brought the fleet down to the Philippines, their families came with them too. So I get a little bit more into that, but I just took care of that, didn't I? Okay, but there were two types of officers, like I said, that went out the Asiatic fleet, either the very old or the very incompetent. So I'm just kind of wondering what Thomas Hart thought about the President of the United States or the Chief of Naval Operations sending him out here. But he was okay, so he was getting up there in age, but he was really considered quite a competent officer. Now, we almost went to war with Japan in 1937. They had expanded their efforts in trying to secure China and their natural resources. And when they went into Shanghai, there were also a number of gunboats on the river not too far from Shanghai. And Japanese ships actually attacked and sank one of our gunboats that were on the Yangtze River. That was a USS Panay. There was concern that we might go to war even then with Japan. Of course, the United States really didn't have the wherewithal to go to war with Japan or anybody else at this time. I mean, Congress was appropriating funds, so we were building more ships and trying to recruit more people in the Navy, but it was not an all-out process, as it later turned out after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Now, the enlisted men, on the other hand, tended to be career men. That was considered really good duty if you're an enlisted man. Because a lot of these guys would go over there, and when their enlistments ran out, they would re-enlist to stay out there. A lot of them married local women, whether it was in the Philippines or on the Chinese mainland, and they were allowed to billet on land. So some of these enlisted men, if they were back in the States or someplace else, they couldn't afford to do that. And also, they took on Chinese nationals to help them run the boats. I mean, did anybody ever read Sand Pebbles or see the movie with Steve McQueen? I think that was an excellent book, because the guy who wrote that had retired from the Navy. He was a chief petty officer. I can't remember his name offhand, but he was an old China hand. And right after his retirement, he wrote his first and only novel, and it was a great success. And I think it was a very good portrayal of what life probably was like for enlisted men in the China fleet. But the thing is, not just because Congress was not appropriating funds for for the military services, but the Asiatic fleet was sort of out of sight and out of mind. So they were getting not the best ships, not the best equipment, and a lot of the ammunition was so old it was near useless. They had 5-inch shells, anti-aircraft shells, and only a fraction of them would actually go off when they were fired. We had the same problem with our torpedoes. Only about 20% of them, after the war started in Asia, only about 20% of them proved to be effective. And well, like it says here, it had a failure rate of about 80%. So it's not the sort of ammunition you want to go to war with. And besides, a lot of these ships had antiquated guns too. Very few, if any, of them had 40 millimeter or 20 millimeter anti-aircraft guns on them. And this is Cavite Naval Base. This is in Manila Harbor. It's just like a little thumb of a peninsula sticking out here. But that was a naval base out there. It had dry docks there. It had tank farms. It had storage facilities. It even had a hospital. But it was all crammed together in this one little tiny peninsula. And when the Japanese finally bombed it on 10 December 1941, they just leveled the place. But now, Thomas Hart, though, like I'd said in a previous lecture, he was so sure that we would be going to war with Japan any time that he started making long-term plans in case that happened. One of the things they did was taking 55-gallon drums, filling them with diesel or whatever other petroleum products they needed, and then having them dispersed to other parts of the Philippines. But when they attacked there, they pretty much wiped out the place. And I think there were 2 submarines tied up there. One was hit and sunk. One was hit and damaged. But they managed to repair it and get it out of there. So in December 1941, the U.S. Navy's largest concentration of modern submarines was in the Philippines, with 29 of those submarines based in Manila at Cavite. Unfortunately, we had terrible torpedoes. At this stage in the war, we had the worst torpedoes in the war. And like I said in a previous lecture, we did not correct all those torpedo problems until something like September of 1943, when they came out with the new Mark 18 torpedo. Now, Manila was abandoned. MacArthur refused to cooperate with Thomas Hart in any way possible. They would have regular meetings, but MacArthur spent most of the time berating the Navy, even berating Admiral Hart in front of his face, even though Admiral Hart outranked him. But Admiral Hart was not the sort of person who was going to get in a fight with his counterpart there in the Army. So there was some bad blood even before Pearl Harbor took place. But he started, even before Pearl Harbor, though, he started dispersing his ships. He didn't want them all concentrated there where they could be wiped out in some sort of sneak attack. And he started sending some of them down to Borneo, which was under the British at the time, and other parts of the Philippines. He just didn't want them concentrated. Matter of fact, in conversations with Douglas MacArthur, MacArthur told me, he says, even if we go to war with Japan, it probably won't happen until 1945 or 1946. Well, Admiral Hart thought differently. He thought it could happen at any time. And so I put this here because there were machinations against Thomas Hart from the get-go. MacArthur, especially after the war started, after Pearl Harbor was bombed, and when he had 8 to 10 hours notice to react to it, he was still caught with his pants down. He locked himself up in his... Well, anybody like to answer that before I continue my... Okay, where was I? Okay. Yeah, I lost my thought now. Where was it? Help me out here. What did I... Oh, yeah, he was locked up, and his airway... Thank you very much. I'm 78. I'm starting to lose it. Anyway, so his air wing commander, General Brereton, who's in charge of the Air Force there in the Philippines, went to the penthouse, wanted to get permission from MacArthur to launch his B-17s and attack the Japanese bases in the southern tip of Taiwan. General Sutherland, who was his chief of staff, refused to let him talk to MacArthur. And I don't think we really know why MacArthur locked him away, but a lot of historians and biographers of MacArthur think he just froze up. He just went into sort of a catatonic trance, and they had to go through Sutherland. And then Sutherland says, no, you don't have permission to bomb. The general says, we have to wait until we're attacked. Of course, Brereton's argument was, well, we've already been attacked in Pearl Harbor. Was he waiting for us to be attacked in the Philippines? Well, that's exactly what happened. He managed to launch his B-17s, and he didn't want them on the ground like happened in Pearl Harbor. So he launched them, and they flew around for a while. But the Japanese up in Taiwan, they were socked in by fog, so they couldn't launch their attack as soon as they could. So by about noon in the Philippines time, they had to bring the B-17s back in for refueling. In the meantime, the crews went off to get lunch, and guess what? That's when the fog had lifted in Taiwan, and the Japanese showed up right after they had landed and pretty much wiped out much of MacArthur's Air Force, the B-17s, P-40s, and other aircraft they had there and on Nichols Field. But MacArthur was in a bad place, and he knew it so. And MacArthur's habit was that if something was going wrong, it was not his fault, and he would blame somebody else. So from this point on, he was sending message after message to General Marshall of the Army and other people in Washington, saying that the Navy has let me down. He was accusing Hart of being a coward. He was accusing Hart of being all sorts of things that resulted in some of the losses that he incurred in the opening days of the war. Hart was relieved from duty on 15 February 1942. So just keep that date in mind, and I'll show you why it's important. Because even though he managed to save most of the ships in his Asiatic fleet, except for a few that were still left up on the Yangtze River, he managed to get them down into different parts of the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies. And the orders originally that he received was to try to get your ships out of those waters before the Japanese get down there, try to get them to Australia. But as soon as that order was presented to him, they changed the order, and it was decided to relieve Admiral Hart and turn over all the Allied ships in the area to a Admiral Helfrich of the Dutch Navy, because not only was MacArthur trying to get rid of Hart, but also Helfrich said, well, these are our colonial waters. I'm the one who should be in charge. I know the geography better than Hart. And for whatever reason, Winston Churchill got in on the act. So, and for about 8 days, Admiral Hart was kind of out of the picture, because after they bombed Cavite and General MacArthur declared Manila to be an open city without even telling Admiral Hart, he had no choice but then try to get out himself. So he spent 8 days on a submarine trying to get down to the Dutch East Indies. And during that 8 days, he was pretty much out of communication. And all these machinations were going on behind his back, mostly on the part of Douglas MacArthur, but also other parties who thought that Hart should be relieved. Now, General Marshall, at least according to what I read, really didn't pay much attention to Douglas MacArthur because he was used to this sort of thing. But there are other people in Washington who were beginning to question whether Admiral Hart was the right guy for the job. And by then, Admiral Stark had been replaced as Chief of Naval Operations by Admiral Ernest King. And Ernest King was aware of what was going on. And so basically he told Admiral Hart, he says, they're going to relieve you, it looks like, for political reasons, not because you did anything wrong. So rather than get in a fight at this time, early stages of the war, how about if you just request to be relieved for health reasons? And so that's what he did. And so on 15 February, then he was sent back to the States. But on the 4th of January, where they actually had some success, a number of these old Clemson-class destroyers managed to sneak into Balikpapan, right off the east coast of Borneo. That's where the Japanese were heading anyway, because that's where a lot of the oil fields were there, and in Sumatra, just to the southwest. So the Japanese had come in there, they had landed their troops there, but in the process, a couple of Dutch submarines managed to get in there, and they were using the old Whitehead torpedoes, which are much better than what we had at the time, and managed to sink a couple of ships. And then some Dutch Air Force planes came over and bombed some other ships. So it was nighttime, and the Japanese were on alert, but they were looking down for submarines and looking up for airplanes. And the fact that a number of these old Clemson-class destroyers managed to sneak in among them in the middle of the night, firing off torpedoes in their deck guns. The Japanese were looking up and they were looking down, but they weren't looking for to be attacked on the surface. So they managed to sink at least 4 of the 12 enemy transports there, plus whatever the Dutch had sunk before then. And then in 1920, there was the Battle of Bundong Straits, and that was just off the coast of Bali there. A couple of Japanese ships, I think, were sunk, as well as at least one Dutch ship that was involved. Because by then, we had 4 different countries trying to stop the Japanese from taking the Dutch East Indies. We had the Americans, the British, the Dutch, and the Australians. And even though originally Hart's orders were to get the ships out of there, get them to Australia, they changed them, they fired him, they put Admiral Helflich in charge, and then they put all these different ships from 4 different countries. A lot of the skippers of ships couldn't communicate with each other because they didn't speak each other's language. So it was a shoestring job, and it turned out to be pretty much of a disaster, because from that point on, we started losing more and more ships down there. This is the old USS Langley. That was the first aircraft carrier in the United States Navy, and it was built on the hull of an old collier, USS Jupiter, I think it was called. But by this time we had the Saratoga, the Lexington, the Yorktown, the Enterprise, and some new carriers were coming on board that could do up to 30 knots or better. And Langley could only do about 13 knots. So by this stage in its life, it had been converted to a seaplane tender, and it was being used to transport P-40s to Indonesia. They thought they could beef up the Air Force, send some P-40s and some P-40 pilots. Originally, they were told to make a run to either get to Ceylon, which is Sri Lanka now. But then when Helflich took over, he says, no, we want those P-40s. So they were ordered back to Indonesian waters, and then they were promptly sunk. So they didn't get the planes off. I think some had been offloaded on land, but they didn't have the time to put them together and make them flyable. Some of the pilots were lost on Langley. Others were on a destroyer that was later sunk, and all the pilots and the crew from that ship were executed by the Japanese. Then we get into 27 February 1942. This is several days or a week after Admiral Hart had been relieved of his land. And this is when he's still under the Dutch admiral after Hart was relieved. And they got in a number of other naval battles. Some Japanese ships were sunk, but the Allies got the worst of it for the most part. And then 28 February, it was a battle of Sunda Straits. And that's when they finally, I think under Admiral Helflich, they realized that the game was up, because the Japanese had superior ships, they had superior torpedoes, they had command of the air. The Allies had absolutely no command of the air. We had very few airplanes left, and most of them were shot down or lost in other ways. So by this time, what the few surviving ships were trying to make a break for to Australia. Some made it, but the majority did not. But in trying to go through the Sunda Straits, which is between the western end of Java and the south tip of Sumatra, they ran into another Japanese task force where they were trying to land troops there on Java, and they also had cruisers and other ships there. So they ran right into the middle of it, and both the HMAS Perth and the heavy cruiser Houston were lost there. Matter of fact, the captain of Houston, Captain Rooks, was actually died there when his ship was sunk. And other ships may have made it further south. I gave an example of that when I was talking about the role of enlisted men and women in the Pacific War. There was a USS Asheville. One of the people I interviewed, his brother was on that. It was intercepted by a cruiser squad, Japanese cruiser squadron. It was sunk, and the survivors were either left to drown or they were executed by the Japanese. We're still not quite sure on that story. Another number of other ships were sunk trying to get to Australia. Two of them actually made it to Perth, but they happened to be there on 19 February 1942 when land-based and carrier-based Japanese aircraft attacked Darwin. They sank all the ships in the harbor, obliterated the town of Darwin, killed over 200 civilians in the process. So there wasn't a hell of a lot left of the Asiatic fleet by then. And now there were aircraft in the Asiatic fleet. They had Patrol Squadron 10 PBY Catalinas, but 2 of the 28 were lost during the first week of the war. And others were lost later in the war, and a few actually managed to get out of there and escape down to Australia. But these are some of the key players in the Dutch Navy. I mentioned Admiral Helfrich. After Tommy Hart was relieved of his command, then he took over, and he's the one that took all these 4 different ships from 4 different navies, tried to organize them, and sent them off to stop the Japanese, and they had very little success, and it was a complete disaster. In fact, Admiral Dorman, who was leading one of the attacks, went down with his ship when it was sunk during one of the battles. He eventually got out of the Dutch East Indies when everything else he tried had failed. I'm not sure what his story was after that, but I don't think he played much of a role in the war from that point on. I think I've also mentioned Broome. Broome is about halfway down the west coast of Australia. They were using a lot of these flying boats. Some of them were for Qantas flying boats. They were being chartered by the Dutch government as well as the U.S. military to try to get some of their military and diplomatic personnel as well as their families out of the Dutch East Indies. Well, quite a number of these, maybe about a dozen of them, made it as far as Broome, where they were going to stay overnight. Okay, well, Broome, still not much of a town today if you've ever been there, but back there was even less of a town. There were no facilities for the civilians on shore, so the plan was for most of them to just sleep on those boats out there in the harbor until the next day, and then they would take off and fly the rest of the way down to Perth. Unfortunately, Japanese aircraft, I think mostly carrier aircraft, arrived there before these flying boats could take off, and they strafed. You can see they strafed and burned all of them. Now, these waters around there are full of sharks and saltwater crocodiles, so a lot of these people who were on there were killed, including Dutch women and children. Now, among the survivors was Lieutenant Tom Moore of Pat Wing 10, and he went on to become not only Chief of Naval Operations, but head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the 1970s. So in conclusion, this is obviously not one of my longer lectures, so I don't have to worry too much, I don't think. But this just kind of sums it up. Now, Admiral Hart was relieved for political reasons. He did nothing wrong. I would argue that he did everything right given the circumstances and given the limited assets that he had at his disposal. I would also argue that Douglas MacArthur did just about everything wrong. He didn't think the Japanese would attack until 1945 or 1946. His orders were to take food and ammunition once the war started and take them to the Bataan Peninsula and then get all of his troops there and hold off the Japanese as long as they could, with the possible hope that maybe the Pacific Fleet would get out there and rescue them. Of course, that didn't happen. He argued with the marshal, I can stop them on the beaches. So rather than taking food and ammunition and whatever else he might have needed on the Bataan Peninsula, he tried to stop them on the beaches, and it failed miserably. And at the last moment, he decided, well, I better get my men if I can get them out of harm's way in time, get them out on the Bataan Peninsula. But he didn't get all the food and everything else he needed. So once the survivors got to the Bataan Peninsula, they were already on starvation rations. A lot of the food was still in warehouses around Manila and had to be destroyed rather than get it to where it should have been on the Bataan Peninsula. And except for that one submarine at Cavite, no U.S. ships were lost under his command. they were all lost after he left. Remember that date, 15 February 1942? And so from that point on, the Asiatic fleet was no more within 2 weeks of Hart's dismissal. Okay? There's sort of a 90-day period, and then it was all over. And like I said, MacArthur blamed the Navy for all of his failures. He would take no blame for it. And as you recall in my lecture on Pearl Harbor, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, Admiral Kimmel, the Navy, his career was over. General Short of the Army, his career was over. MacArthur made so many mistakes you would think his career was over too, but it wasn't. And he was eventually awarded the Medal of Honor for whatever he was supposed to have done right in the Philippines. And the Asiatic fleet had no modern equipment. We didn't have radar except the USS Boise, which came out late. It was the only ship out there that had radar, but it really didn't participate in any of the events up to that time. We didn't have really good AA guns, no 20 millimeters, no 40 millimeters, no functioning torpedoes. Like I said, about 20% of them proved effective. Most of the ammunition was outdated. It wouldn't explode when it hit, or anti-aircraft shells wouldn't explode when they were supposed to go off. So everything was against Hart, but I think he did everything right given the circumstances that he found himself in. So here again, here's a date. Hart left on 15 February, and these, you don't have to memorize these, but these are the dates, all of the ships that were lost after he left. And if they had followed the original order to get them out to Australia, rather than turning them over to Admiral Helfrich, some of those ships and the men aboard might have survived. Like I said, Asheville, when it was lost with everybody on the ship except for one, who was taken as a POW, but he died of disease in one of the POW camps. But he shared the story of Asheville with some of the other POWs, so they didn't really know for sure what happened to Asheville and some of these other ships until after the war. There was another one, Edsel. It was also sunk at about the same time, and likewise the U.S. authorities as well as family members didn't know what happened until after the war. Okay, yeah, I told you, this is where I live. And this is what the volcano looks like from my backyard. Okay? So, like I said, I'm putting it on the market. Okay, one last thing, because I've got time this time. I don't feel so rushed. But the techs here, they're filming all of my lectures. They're on TV, but they're giving me copies, and I've loaded them onto YouTube. I'm loading them on one at a time so that when you get home, if you want to download those and share them with friends or schools or veterans groups or however you want. It's free. I'm not making any money off it. And once I get home, I'm going to try to find a 9-year-old kid who can show me how to download those to my website. Okay? Now, my website is voicesfromthepacificwar.com. And I have business cards. I've given some out with my website. But this is what it looks like if you go. What I do to find my own lectures, I go into YouTube and I type in aircraft carriers in the Pacific War under parentheses, and that will pop up. And then below that, you'll find this pink square with a B in it. But I think the B is supposed to be black. And then this is the site. If you can't, I know you probably can't memorize that, but it's at Bruce Petty 4718. But anyway, I'll try to sort this out before the end of the cruise so that if you're interested, they're all yours. You can do whatever you want with them, okay? And I'll see, tomorrow I'm talking about Papua New Guinea and Guadalcanal, okay? I'll see you then.